Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Dr. Richard Overy, a honorary professor at the University of Exeter and historian of the Second World War. Professor Overy wrote many books and just recently published the great work Reign of Ruin, Tokyo, Hiroshima, and the Surrender of Japan, in which he discusses not only the atomic bomb, but the larger context of aerial bombings, the military situation in 1945, and the political process that led to the Tenno's capitulation to the US forces, which finally ended the Second World War. The process of surrender is what we want to discuss today. So, Professor Overy, welcome.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time for this, because you wrote this fantastic, very readable book on what happened toward the very end of the Second World War. And in Europe, it's often forgotten that that there was an Asian theater, and that actually only Japan's capitulation then ended this huge tragedy in 1945. What was your motivation for writing this book in which you focus on more than just Hiroshima?
Well, my motive actually goes back 12 years to when I published my book on the bombing war in Europe. I wanted to make it a general book on the bombing war, including the Asian war, but my editor said the book was already too long, which it was, and they refused to allow me to put it in. So I'd done much of the research, but I waited for an opportunity when I could actually put this into book form, and I thought I'd wait for an anniversary, and the 80th anniversary seems to be an appropriate one. It's widely commemorated across the world, 80 years after the end of the Second World War.
And what is to you this importance then of the bombing campaigns? And I mean, they were also implemented in Germany, of course, and they were and still are a very controversial part of the Second World War. There's, of course, this very persuasive argument that it was necessary, in order to bring the war to an end quickly, right, and force the surrender of the Axis powers. But what is your take and analysis on this?
Well, the idea was that it would perhaps force surrender. In the German case, of course, it took 5 years of bombing, so it's hardly a quick strategy. I think the problem in both the European and the Japanese theaters is that what we're looking at is an escalation of violence, both in Britain and in the United States at the beginning of the war. There was a strong commitment against bombing, which would harm civilians. Over the course of the war, that constraint was gradually removed. More and more, the emphasis was on achieving victory and saving lives, British lives or American lives. And so bombing civilians became one part of the strategy. It's a very important issue, I think, really, because this escalation, radicalization of strategy happens quite often in warfare, and we need to understand why.
And what was it for the Allies, and what was it specifically for the Americans, who, let's remember, came into the Second World War only in 1941, right, after being bombed into it in Hiroshima by the Japanese? What was the process for the US to actually say, like, okay, we're now going to do systematic bombings, especially also in Asia?
Well, in Europe, they didn't want to do what the British were doing, area bombing, basically firebombing the centre of cities. And they couldn't quite understand what the British hoped to achieve by it. So it's quite curious that when they got to the Japanese theatre, they adopted almost exactly the same strategy. Several reasons, I think. One is that conventional precision bombing was almost impossible against the Japanese home islands. They tried to bomb from 25,000 to 30,000 feet. There was a jet stream wind over Japan, which made it almost impossible to concentrate on a precise target and drop your bombs. So the result was, for the first few months of bombing of Japan, they achieved almost nothing. And it was partly frustration at that drove them to think, well, is there another way we can get at Japan's war industry and our war workers? And they decided that low-level firebombing would be the most effective. Now, of course, there was the moral consideration, but they set that aside, really, for a number of reasons. One, because they wanted to get the war over quickly and save American lives. Two, because I think they had a very different attitude towards the Japanese population and towards the Japanese in general than they had towards the Germans. They felt, I think, much less moral restraint in killing Japanese civilians than they would have done in the German case, because they had an image of the Japanese by that stage of the war as basically, barbarous people were waging inhumane warfare, torturing and murdering prisoners of war and so on and so on. And this created, I think, a psychological climate which made it much easier for both American airmen and for the American public to accept the firebombing of Japanese cities.
In these fire bombings, they were severe, right? I mean, today, especially since it's the 80th anniversary, was the 80th anniversary of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombings, it is often forgotten that the fire bombings themselves killed just as much, if not more people, especially in Tokyo, where over one night, 100,000 people perished in the poor quarters of the city. Can you maybe speak a little bit to that and how it ties in with the psychological warfare against the population?
Yes, I think we often, overlook Tokyo, and it's very important to remember that as the first stage of the shift in American strategy, where you were going to destroy city centers, where you would kill very large numbers of ordinary people. And Tokyo was, from the Japanese point of view, a catastrophic operation. 83,000 people plus, we don't know exactly how many, died incinerated mainly on that single night. In fact, more people died then than died in the first moments of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And it went on. 250,000 Japanese civilians were killed in city after city after city. And for the American airmen who were leading it, particularly General Curtis LeMay, he was convinced that a few more months of bombing destroy almost the entire urban area of Japan. Imagine it, they destroyed 60% of the urban area. I think it's quite hard to visualize that today. If you just went on and destroyed the rest of it, but Japan would have no choice, couldn't make war, it would just give up. And so conventional bombing was seen both on the American side, but actually it was seen on the Japanese side as a more significant factor in the end in bringing about Japanese surrender than the two atomic attacks.
From your research, what was the expectation about this? Let's say, especially on the Japanese side. In my own research, I found that in 1944, already in summer, early summer, around June, the Japanese started evacuating foreign embassies of neutral countries like Switzerland, Sweden, Spain, and so on, and they evacuated them to Karuizawa because they said the city is not going to be safe anymore. On the other hand, the population, I think, was not briefed to that extent. Do you know anything about the expectations of the Japanese when it comes to these aerial bombings?
Well, I think the Japanese, when the Japanese military, when they looked out at what the Americans could do, I think they're rather confused, actually, about exactly what American strategy would be. But they did know that if the Americans got bases near enough, then they probably would do to Japanese cities what had been done to German cities. So they did begin the process of evacuation, children, for example, women, pregnant women, etc., out into the countryside and the smaller towns. And as soon as the bombing began, that evacuation, both voluntary and involuntary, if you like, was speeded up. So that in the end, 10 to 11 million Japanese city dwellers ended up in the countryside and small towns. An extraordinary transfer of population. What they were not certain about, of course, was the technology, because they hadn't got agents in America who were sending material back to the Tokyo intelligence authorities. The B-29 they were not sure about. They only got to know about it when the Americans began B-29 raids from China, very, very unsuccessful raids from China in the later part of 1944. And then they began to work hard on that. What is the B-29? How can we, combat it? And they found they couldn't particularly. The anti-aircraft fire was limited and not very effective. The Japanese fighter planes couldn't fly as high as the B-29. So really, in a sense, they shrugged their shoulders and waited to see what would happen. And of course, the sad thing was that there wasn't much defense against the B-29. Bombing at night, coming in low. Japanese light fighters were very ineffective. The great majority of losses on the American side was caused by weather, technical breakdown, and so on, or accident, not from Japanese resistance. So yes, the Japanese were aware this was going to happen. They took some steps, but actually there were very few steps they could have taken to really mitigate what the Americans were determined to do.
Do you know who was mostly aware of Japan's vulnerabilities? Because one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that Japan was extremely fractured when it comes to the political process. And you had the army, you had the navy, which were independent, basically, power centers. You had the very weak central government. And I keep repeating, look, between 31 and 45, you had 13 different cabinets. And 13 cabinets. There was almost every year cabinet got overturned, and then you had the 10 also. Who was mostly aware of the actual strategic vulnerabilities of the country?
Well, the Americans were not very aware. I mean, there were people in the State Department who had experience in Japan and who did try to paint a picture, say, look, you don't really understand Japanese politics and Japanese culture. But there was a strong sense, particularly among the military, after years in the Pacific, fighting what they regarded as a fanatical enemy, a sense that the Japanese population was united in its fanaticism, and that they would go on resisting to the very end, suicidally, even for the home islands. And that had an unfortunate effect, because it meant that the Americans had to find some way they could somehow unlock that fanaticism and so on. But as you said, I mean, in fact, complete opposite was the case. There were deep divisions within the political elite, deep divisions between army and navy, and indeed between different sections of the army and different sections of the navy. And the real problem was the lack of coordination. The one single factor in 45 that mattered to the Americans, of course, was the decision by some of the army leadership that they would fight the final battle for the home islands, suicidal battle. They would arm the people. They would, find some way of stopping the Americans from occupying Japan. And that was the strategy that everybody else had to kind of tiptoe around, including the emperor. They had to find ways of terminating the war without alienating the army, which was determined to fight that final battle. And I think the Americans just simply, there was no way they could understand it. They had no spies in Tokyo. And the only way they could do it, perhaps, was by intercepting radio messages. But actually, at this level, there was nothing to intercept.
But the frustrating part is that there were a few people, and I would say first and foremost, Ambassador Joseph Grew, who served for 10 years in Japan, and then when he was evacuated in 42, became Undersecretary of State in the US, and he was the head of the so-called Japan hands, right? The people who actually understood how the political process worked. And they kept saying, look, A, you need to give the Japanese, assure them that they can keep the emperor, and B, you need to make sure that the Navy and the Army don't collapse the cabinet, because if either of these two withdraws their minister, then the cabinet is forced to step down, right? And so both of them have kind of a Damocles spear, hold this sort of Damocles over the cabinet. And that was a very, very difficult thing. And maybe let's turn now to the process of getting the Japanese to agree to surrender, because this had to be taken in unison again in order to then work. And what is your assessment of that, of the process, the political process, to actually create to make sure that the Navy and the Army subordinate themselves to the political process?
Well, of course, there never was a consensus until the emperor had the final imperial conference on the late on the 9th of August, when he said to them, you've got to accept it. You've got to do what I say. And really an unconstitutional position, as you know, and then the army and the navy more or less had to accept what the emperor had said. But until then, yes, it was a very, very delicate political process. The emperor was aware of how delicate it was. Konoye and other civilian politicians were also aware, not only how delicate it was, but how one day they might end up being assassinated. And indeed, many of Konoye's assistants were arrested by the so-called thought police early in 1945 on grounds of defeatism. So it was a very delicate issue. The Navy was divided. Yonai, the Navy minister, was one of the peace party who really wanted to terminate the war, but there were others in the Navy who were not so keen. Thought again, final suicidal battle, not that they had anything to fight with by the end of 1945. But yes, I mean, how did you get round it? And the way they got round it, of course, as you know, is that in June, the emperor said to mainly to the peace party, look, we've got to find a way. We have to find a way. Look, the firebombing is going on, city after city, small city after small city are being destroyed. We've got to find a way. And they decided in the end that they would get the Soviet Union to intercede. And they did that mainly because the army was also willing to accept that, in the hope that they could extract more from the discussion.
Yeah, but they were trying to get the Soviet Union, with whom Japan had a neutrality pact, right? That was created in April 41. They were trying to go through the Soviet Union and achieve a peace negotiation, right? Have the Soviets work as a mediator to actually have not a capitulation, but a peace negotiation, which is actually what the Axis powers though rejected. They said there will be no discussions. It's Potsdam or nothing. It's Potsdam or you burn even more.
Yes. No, indeed. I think Japanese didn't really understand, and it's quite interesting looking at the historical record here, that they never really articulated what they expected from the Soviet intercession. I think that the emperor agreed to it, and partly because it would keep the army quiet. But the hope was perhaps that they would be able to find some other way around. But there's no doubt that once that had broken down, once the Soviet Union declared war and invaded Manchuria, then it was all over. That, I think, eased the path to the emperor, made it much easier for him that evening to say, okay, enough is enough. Look what we're faced with now, the prospect even of a communist invasion. Come on, now we've got to stop. And at that point, the army did agree that, in the end, they would have to stop. But what an absurd decision to try and ask the Soviet Union, ally of Japan's key enemies, where there was intelligence, quite good intelligence, on the movement of the Red Army eastwards, so that the Kwantung Army in Manchuria knew a lot about what was going on the frontier, and it certainly wasn't peaceful. But they ignored all that in the hope that somehow or other they could get Molotov and Stalin to agree. It was an extraordinary miscalculation. I think we can understand why they made it. But in the end, of course, it did have the effect of speeding up the eventual surrender.
He had a belief of the cabinet, especially the political level, in the force of the neutrality agreement that was still supposed to be valid for one more year, was quite high. And the instructions to the Japanese ambassador in Moscow, he said like, there's no way we can get them to do what we want them to do. But the foreign ministry telling him, like, despite your personal beliefs, you're supposed to help us get Stalin to intervene in favor of us. So there was just a very, very strong belief actually in the Russians, in the Soviets, to live up to their written promise in 41, wasn't there?
Yes, I mean, of course, they'd already said they were not going to extend the Non-Aggression Pact from 1946, which again was a clear signal to the Japanese that, that very soon the Soviet Union would become their enemy. I think what we have to recognize is that in that first week of August, the week, even before Hiroshima and so on, I mean, there's a great deal of confusion among the Japanese elites. They didn't really know which way to turn. They had strange hopes, perhaps hope in the Soviet Union. Hirohito knew that Japan could not be properly defended. All the evidence suggested that Japan's war economy was falling apart. How was he going to get the peace party and the army and the navy together? And of course, it was in the end not Hiroshima but the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, which resolved that dilemma. A great deal of confusion in that first week or so, and confusion after Hiroshima. Nobody really knew what it was. Was it an atomic bomb? If so, what did it mean? And the report on this only arrived much later, after, in fact, the emperor had already made his decision. So I think we have to see the Japanese situation in the early days of August, not as, we're determined to fight, and Hiroshima comes, oh no, we give up. But the opposite, we're trying to find a way of terminating the war. We're struggling to get through the political morass, which is, diplomatic morass, to allow us to do it. And the Soviet invasion allowed them to do it. I don't think that we can argue that Hiroshima was the decisive thing.
I agree with you. Conventional wisdom has it that Hiroshima was so catastrophic and so unthinkable that it swayed the Japanese, right? But also from my reading, my argument would be that, and I would like to ask you if you agree, my argument would be that Hiroshima was first and foremost convenient for the emperor in his speech that he gave to say, like, we lost to superior technological power. But the actual military rationale was changed by the Soviet Union. That's what convinced the army and the navy that now they're gonna take apart Japan, and we're gonna be ripped apart. But on the public speech act view, the propaganda toward the own population, the emperor could very conveniently say, like, okay, it's too bad, we lost to better technology, because it was in the recording, it was in the golden record. So
it was, yeah.
How do you see that?
That was only in the recording. It wasn't in either of the imperial conferences on the 10th of August or one on the 14th of August. So that's, I think, quite significant. In fact, he makes more reference to conventional bombing, which had done more damage and was continuing to do damage all the way through the first 2 weeks of August. So the last raid, in fact, occurred after the Japanese had actually surrendered. Yes, it was convenient, I think, for the broadcast of the Japanese people, because he needed something to persuade the Japanese people who got such mixed messages over the course of 1945. We're winning, we're losing. Here was something he could say to them, which they would understand, and it would justify the decisions he had to take. But in terms of the political background, I think that the decision, the emperor's sacred decision, as it was called, to ask his cabinet and the Supreme War Council to accept the Potsdam Declaration, the ultimatum from the Allies, that there were a lot of other factors that played into that. The conventional bombing, the firebombing, was one. The other one, I think, which has so often been neglected in explaining the surrender, of course, was fear of social unrest. Fear that, the Japanese population couldn't sustain the war effort any longer. They were hungry. The threat of starvation began to loom. They worked enormously long hours. 10 million of them were in the countryside, finding it very difficult to get food. There was growing evidence of dissent, and fear that somehow or other the Japanese war effort might end like the Russian war effort in 1917, I think played quite an important part. And we know that, once the Russians had invaded Manchuria, Suzuki, the prime minister, says, this is, look, we're facing a threat of communism, not just at home, but coming from abroad as well. This is the last thing Japan's elite wanted. They hated communism. And I think that that's a factor in this whole story, which is not given, I think, sufficient weight. And I think the emperor himself was very aware of that. Very aware that his people were not likely to be able to sustain the war effort very much longer.
And then once the decision was taken, I mean, we know that there were efforts actually by low-level officers to even. So what happened is that the emperor recorded his own voice on a disc, which was then to be played out, right? And that was in and of itself unheard of, because never the emperor had been heard on the radio before. And we know that after the recording, there were officers who tried to do a palace revolt and get their hands on the recording and destroy it, because they said we need to protect the emperor from the malign influences of those defaitists, right, who captured him. So we need to protect him from himself. But that failed, luckily. And then the peace process actually started working in a way that I think we underestimate just how successful the surrender became in terms of laying down weapons and stopping the shooting. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, I mean there were elements in the army who were unhappy about what was going on, but it was only on August 14th when the emperor had already made his decision that they began to act. I mean, I think, in fact, I mean the radical elements of the army are much broader than that, actually. But the war minister succeeded really in putting a stop to it, saying, "I don't want this either, but we've got to do it because the emperor has said." That also gave him a way out. If the emperor says, our God emperor says, then we have to obey. I don't think that the attempted coup on the 14th was ever really a very serious attempt. But yes, the surrender when it came. I think we need to be aware that, of course, thousands of Japanese soldiers were very happy to end the war. Hundreds of thousands ended up dead. Almost 3 million in the end, in fact, throughout the conflict. And I mean, clearly many Japanese people, ordinary people, who suffered. The shame to Japan, the dishonor, the fact that, Japan could not prevail and so on, mingled, I think, with a strong sense of, thank God the war is over. And the success of the emperor and his advisors in being able to retain the imperial system, despite the ultimatum, meant that they could begin the process of rebuilding really very quickly. And I think that for many Japanese, the war had been, a terrible experience, the last years of the war. And now it was over, and they could, begin the process of rebuilding a different Japan. So yes, I mean, in the end, the surrender was, from the Japanese point of view, a successful termination of the war.
But quite unthinkable if we go, like, let's say 1942. If anyone in 42 had said then that let's say 43. If anyone in 43 had said in 10 years from now, you're going to have a treaty with the Americans who are going to guarantee your security, and you're going to be an ally of the United States, and you're going to live prosperous and happily with the Americans for 70, 80 years in the Pacific, they would have laughed you out of the room, wouldn't they?
They would, yes. No, they would indeed, yes. I mean, it's partly because, they set the Americans up in the end, like the British Empire too. It's the key Western enemies that were choking Asia, preventing Japan from achieving its destiny, and so on and so on. And so they were the big baddies. But you need to remember, in the 1920s, the Americans were not the baddies, in fact. I mean, there was quite a lot of pro-American sentiment in Japan, quite close relations. It deteriorated sharply in the course of the 1930s and the economic slump. Relations with the British Empire, one has to say, were never particularly favourable after the termination of the Anglo-Japanese Naval Treaty in 1922. But yes, nobody would have said that in 1943. Also, there was still a sense in 1943 in the military leadership and in the country at large that Japan had a chance of winning. I mean, if anybody had actually sat down and done the sums and shown them, they would know they had no chance of winning. And that, if they fought the war to the end, they would fight, with great sacrifices. But in 43, that was not the message that people were getting. The message they were getting was, yes, this is something, we can hold out, and the Americans will lack the will to carry on fighting. I mean, after Guadalcanal, which is a long, long way from Japan, a long, dirty, bloody battle and so on, I think the Japanese, although they lost it, I think they certainly thought, well, how much longer will the Americans put up with this? I think, their original strategy, we'll occupy this periphery and challenge the Americans, who lack, military will, and in the end, we will reach an agreement with them. And for some people in Japan, that remained the view all the way through to 1945, until it was so evident you couldn't reach an agreement.
So in a sense, to terminate a war and to successfully surrender, what needs to sink in is just the inevitability of the political process of the war. I mean, war is of course killing, mass killing, but it's also mass killing is a way of communication in war. And do you think in 1945 that was the Soviet entry into the war made it clear to basically the last one that there is no holding out. This is going to grind us down over the next months and years.
Yes, no, I think it was a very strong realization of that, particularly as the Kwantung Army had been the elite army of the Japanese, and the Red Army went through it like a knife through butter. It was a blitzkrieg on an extraordinary scale, actually, and Japanese resistance in China evaporated. So yes, you didn't need to think very hard about that, to give up quickly. Otherwise, you would have the Red Army perhaps in Hokkaido. You would have Stalin saying, come on, I'm going to carve up Japan like I've carved up Eastern Europe. And that, of course, was the last thing that they wanted. So, yes, it didn't take long, I think, even for the army diehards, if they were honest with themselves, to recognize that, the game was up.
I'm asking this because I think as we speak today, 80 years after this process, we're actually witnessing another process of trying to wind down a war. I'm speaking about Ukraine, and we see how difficult it is to actually create a political process where all of the stakeholders who have something to say in the game and who somehow can intervene, even on a low level, in order to ruin a peace agreement. How difficult it is to get everybody on the same page. And I know it's not a good habit to ask a historian to draw parallels to the current, but do you have any thoughts about this? What the Japanese surrender teaches us also about bringing peace back to Europe?
Yes, I mean, it's an interesting question. And it is true, in fact, in both cases, both that and the case of Israel and Hamas, that, the process is long drawn out. And the military pressure is kept up all the time in the hope that somehow or other you can reach an agreement. And in this case, of course, it would be an agreement on Russian terms or an agreement on Israeli terms and so on. And because, in Ukraine's case, it has the support of much of NATO, that process is much harder, but that's not quite the same, I think, as what happens in the Second World War. I think that the point you made is that we can see the Japanese example, and now we can see the example of Ukraine as two different narratives about how difficult it is to bring a conflict to an end. In the case of Russia and Ukraine, you could have a rational argument about how it ought to end, but I think there's no certainty in the end about how it will end, and the same is true of the war in Gaza. Even the historians who've spent all their lives working on the war, as I have, you hesitate to predict what's going to happen in the next year.
Yeah, because each case is different, but the underlying sociological mechanisms of having pro-war and pro-peace factions, having people who argue that it is better to give up and work with what we can get, and the others who say, like, no, we continue. And in the Japanese case, I mean, the military said yes. 100 million martyrs. That was their motto. Because Japan only had 60 million, but they included the 40 million Korea. They wanted to, they wanted to guerrilla warfare. They said, like, let them come and then we'll fight them in the bushes. And that would, of course, have been an incredible bloodletting. And it is a huge success of the peace faction to win over them and say, like, shut up, guys, just shut up. And we're going to give up. We are not going to sacrifice 100 million people.
Yeah, so that was propaganda. I mean, I think that the war minister too actually really understood, in fact, the nature of the problem. By the summer of 1945, Japan was running out of weapons, running out of munitions, running out of, of explosives. It had already run out of ships. It was running out of aircraft. What could you do? And I think that had the Americans had to invade, I think the battle would have been much less disastrous than the predictions suggested at the time. Japan would have been defeated and Honshu and Kyushu occupied. But that's, we don't know. That's a what if. I mean, in the case of Ukraine, yes. I mean, the peace party, war party, they're committed to trying to retain their sovereignty and to reject the fruits of Russian aggression for Putin, with strong backing, but perhaps not strong enough. Will there come a point where a majority in the political and military elite say enough is enough? I thought that might come last year. In fact, it didn't. Enough is enough. Our losses are too high. We have no prospect of expelling Russia from the territories that Russia has occupied. So we have to try and live with reality. That may still happen this year. But for an historian, we know so little about what's actually going on in the corridors of power in Kiev or in Moscow. There are lots of very good suppositions and suggestions, but we're going to have to wait 100 years until these archives are open and we can really understand that process.
And then and that's the frustrating thing, like we have to wait for a long time until we get it right. But we have at least we have the benefit of actually understanding the Second World War and understanding the process of surrender in Japan correctly. Yeah. What would you say was the process to ending this and to getting to the Missouri, like where the Japanese then officially signed the instrument of surrender? Internally, what was most important? Was it the authority of the Tenno? Was it the military realizing that they don't want the Japan to be Bolshevized? What was it that allowed for this process to continue, that you needed in terms of in the political system or the sociological system to have that unity to move to surrender?
Well, I think certainly the military, like Emperor, doubted the capacity of Japan's population to carry on, and certainly they weren't going to become armed militia standing on the beaches, trying to kill their one American. And I think that much of the army leadership recognized that, and that was true, of course, in the empire when the emperor sent out all the delegates to the various parts of the empire to say, we have surrendered, so stop fighting, and they did. And I think that that must have played a very important part. I think the second part is, of course, they never said they were surrendering. And never talked about surrender, as you know. They talked about terminating the war. They talked indeed about the benevolence of the emperor in bringing the war to the end and saving lives on all sides and so on. In other words, a complete inversion of the reality. And that was already in the Japanese media before the Americans arrived, a week, 10 days later. And that was already the story for the Japanese to help them cope with the fact of what was basically surrender.
This is a very important point to make. You need a surrender narrative. You need a narrative that makes surrender palpable yeah, to your own population, right? To say that no, this is the best course of action, and it is a sovereign decision to do so. And just one anecdote. I have a Japanese teacher, and his father turned 100 this year. He was 16, 17 in 45 or 18, and when the surrender came, he was stationed in a military base in Honshu, not too far from Tokyo. And when the surrender was broadcasted, it was August 15. August 16?
15th, yeah, 12 o'clock.
August 15. Yeah. That was the moment when it ended for them, and they thought it is over. But because the instrument of surrender wasn't signed until September 2nd, the Allied forces actually didn't stop the bombings yet. They continued for 2 weeks, and his base was destroyed, and he was saved only because he ran an errand outside of the base. But for the people, the Japanese who were on the ground, they thought the end is the 15th of August. So in a sense, they believed it. They really believed, okay, this is it. It's over.
Yeah. Well, no, the bombing didn't carry on after it carried on. I think the last raid was on the night of the 14th, 15th, I think.
On the city, but there were still military targets that were being attacked.
Were there? Yeah. I didn't know that. And I should have done, obviously.
We can communicate about this separately.
Yeah.
His story is that the base was destroyed between August 15 and September 2nd on the mainland. But in any case, the point is that the Japanese really, once it was broadcast to them, it was over. It was over.
No, for them it was over. But there is this curious hiatus between that broadcast and the laying down of arms and so on, and the arrival of the Americans. The Americans, I mean, they've been preparing for this for some time and so on, and I'm quite surprised that more effort was not made to arrive on the Japanese home islands a bit sooner, because all kinds of things happened. There were movements in among the armed forces saying, we're not going to surrender, we're not accepting it, the emperor's lying, etc., and they had to be dissuaded and disarmed and so on. There were threats that, when the Americans landed by plane, the kamikazes would come and destroy the planes as they arrived, etc., and all of this, and as I said, a media program which emphasized the whole time that the war had come to an end because of the kindness of the emperor, not that the war had come to an end because we couldn't win it. The Allies said, stop. And I think for many Japanese that remained the narrative even after the act of surrender had been signed on the September the 2nd by the foreign minister, not by the emperor. That's still the story that somehow or other, the war came to an end. Not that Japan lost, but Japan decided that it wasn't worth the sacrifices for everybody to carry on, and that proved for Japan, after the actual surrender, a very useful psychological approach, I think, to the end of the war. A, it allowed them to begin the process of rebuilding very quickly, and B, it allowed them, of course, to see the Americans not as a barbarous enemy any longer, but as a potential ally.
A good narrative, a good story really goes a long way, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. No, I think, in this case, it's completely matched Japanese culture, because they were not going to say, oh dear, we've surrendered. It's quite different in Germany. In Germany, the surrender was absolute. No question, every square meter of Germany was occupied. The few Germans who carried on fighting fought until they couldn't fight anymore. And then that was it. You have surrendered. And no German was in any doubt that they had been massively defeated. But we need to remember, of course, that Japan still had most of the empire under occupation in August 1945, that no Allied soldier had stepped foot on Japanese soil. And as far as the Japanese army was concerned, there were still 5 million men under arms. So a very different setup from the situation in Germany. In Germany, there is no alternative narrative. In Germany, the narrative is Hitler let us down. We've been destroyed, and we have to start from, as they called it, our zero.
Yeah. No, that's why I keep emphasizing the Japanese case is the most underrated success in peacemaking of the 20th century, that they were able to do it, that it was possible. There was for a country that could have fought on, even though it would have been self-defeating, that they had the political ability to stop it. Yes.
Well, I think it was much was owed to the emperor, actually, who bravely carried on through all this discussion and argument, and who accepted the advice of his closest colleagues that that only a sacred decision, a decision by the god emperor, could actually bring this to an end. And he didn't know, of course, when he sat in that imperial council and made this announcement to his cabinet and to the war council, he didn't know exactly what their reaction was going to be. All he knew was that he wanted the war to come to an end before there was more suffering for the Japanese people. I don't think he worried greatly about the suffering of all the people that Japan had occupied. But he did worry about the suffering of his own people. And I think that there's so much written about Hirohito, the war criminal who never got tried, and so on and so on. But in fact, Hirohito is a much more complex figure. And I think he does play a very important part in these final weeks in making that surrender or termination of the war possible.
Yeah, and just maybe also to clarify, like anything that we're saying here is not to argue that the Japanese were doing a good thing with their war. I mean, it was incredibly brutal. Japan was incredibly brutal to China, to large parts of Southeast Asia. The brutality of their war against the other countries was horrendous. But still, the realization that you can have processes that then lead to the re-establishment of peace is something that needs to be studied more, right? Of how to
yes. Mind you, much of the Japanese population, even politicians too, didn't really understand what was going on in the empire. It's a long way away. The atrocities were fueled by local circumstances and so on, and that's why so many Japanese after 1945 continued to deny that the Japanese had actually been like that. So there was a kind of communication gap between what's happening at the front line and what people think in Japan.
Of course. And then again, if you give half-starved young men who haven't been with their families for years guns and weapons and then tell them to go and take a city, then horrible things will ensue. So we need to make sure that scenario never becomes reality. That these young people are not being sent into all of this and then create these war crimes.
I think the Japanese population, the civilian population at home, knew very little about what was going on because most of the soldiers couldn't come back. There's no system of leave where you came back and said, actually, we've done terrible things, but we shouldn't tell you. They didn't. They were stuck out there. And yes, I mean, you can see why, they lived in atrocious conditions. They committed atrocities, and they were atrociously treated by their own enemy. But all of this is very distant from Japan. Whereas in Germany, for example, the situation was quite different because this is it's a continental war. Soldiers came back from the Eastern Front. They whispered to their families the things they'd seen and done, the Jews they'd murdered, and so on and so on. And much of the German population really knew what was going on in the East, and they'd expected the worst when the Red Army invaded. But in Japan, that process doesn't really happen.
It was a completely different information environment as well. And Professor Overy, this was very fascinating and interesting. I would like to thank you very much for all of these insights. People who want to read more from you should first and foremost get your book, of course. I will put the link into the description. Is there any other place where you sometimes sporadically publish articles or something where people can follow you?
Not really. I'm more books at the moment. I've written the year before this one. I've written this book, Why War, which looks much more synoptically at the whole issue of human belligerence and why are we such a belligerent species. And after reading about Japan, then they might want to follow up and see a little bit more about what I think about war.
That will be fascinating to discuss that book as well. I'll get my hands on it, and then maybe we can do another discussion on it. Thank you very much for your time today, Professor Overy. That was fantastic.
Okay, my pleasure. Bye.
偷偷告诉大家，我最近发现了新法宝 Royal Face 逆时奇迹系列，它有活肤露、全效精华，还有精华霜。尤其我皮肤比较偏干，所以我非常的注重保湿。保湿做得好，肌肤自然烹润。提亮肤色更年轻，抚平皱纹超有感。而且气色变好，用心保养，每天都更美一点。美吧。